Jacques Herzog and Pierre de Meuron. They should be described as architects who are closely connected to the world of art, more so than to technique or writing. Art is something that motivates their activity and nourishes their architecture. Jacques Herzog and Pierre de Meuron. To provide a chronological reference based on the other podcasts we've done, Norman Foster is 15 years older than these young Swiss architects, while Rem Koolhaas is 6 years older. Herzog and de Meuron were born in 1950, placing them in almost a different generation from Norman Foster, yet they are close in age and interests, and often in rivalry and competition with Koolhaas. So much so that during the 1990s and even much of the first decade of this century, the history of architecture and the critical debates in architecture have had two poles, the Netherlands and Switzerland. In each case, there were champions, Koolhaas in the Dutch context and Herzog and de Meuron in the Swiss context. The great critical debate that we've witnessed in recent decades has been precisely between the experimental character of Dutch architecture, which we touched upon the other day through Koolhaas's work, and, on the other hand, the Swiss approach of drawing nourishment from art to construct architecture. This Swiss architecture is often very sober in its presentation but highly refined in its details, distinctly different in their place in the world. While Koolhaas is a cosmopolitan figure, having spent part of his youth in Indonesia, then returning to Amsterdam, living in London, New York, and eventually returning to Rotterdam, the case of these Swiss architects is entirely different. Far from being cosmopolitan, they are people of Basel. Of course, they have traveled and built all over the world, but their roots are firmly planted. Unlike Koolhaas, who periodically talks about moving his studio to Brussels, London, or elsewhere, it would never occur to them to relocate their studio because they are so deeply rooted in Swiss reality that it's impossible to imagine them anywhere else. Therefore, I must talk a bit about Basel, and I'll do so with this image. It is now over 100 years old, and later, I will briefly refer to a figure who, though barely visible here in the grain of the photo, is present, Burckhardt, a great art historian, carrying his portfolio of drawings to teach at the university, passing by the buttresses of the Basel Cathedral. I mention this for a reason, to remind you that Basel is a special city, unlike any other. It sits at the crossroads of three countries, Switzerland, France, and Germany, and this has made it a refuge since the days of religious persecution in Europe. Many intellectuals and others, fleeing across borders, found safety under different regimes, often under different religions. Even Erasmus of Rotterdam, the city of Rem Koolhaas, by the way, ended his days in Basel, seeking protection from religious persecution. The first Bible in Spanish was also published in Basel, because those who translated it into Castilian were followers of Erasmus, and fleeing religious intolerance, they sought refuge in Basel, where the first Spanish Bible, known to you as the Bear Bible, named after the emblem of the Bernese printer who published it, was printed. But today, if I mention Basel to you, two things come to mind: pharmaceuticals and art. The entire major pharmaceutical industry is based there, but more importantly, it is the great capital of art. The Basel Art Fair is the most important in the world. The most significant in the United States, held in Miami, is called Art Basel because it is a branch of Basel. Basel is a city of art par excellence. And not only of art, which partly has to do with its unique location at the intersection of three borders, as art is sometimes a vehicle for other economic values, not always entirely transparent. I mention not only art, but also the history of art, the reflection on art, the thought about art, and here enters Burckhardt, the great art historian who taught in Basel and reintroduced us to the Italian Renaissance. His successor, Wölfflin, in the streets of Basel, continued in the same vein. There, they taught alongside Nietzsche, another man from the north who was in love with the south. This intellectual world of Basel is inseparable from the work of these two young architects. Now I'm going to show them as truly young, not as in the previous photo, but truly young. That is, when they were taking their first steps in the world of architecture, still with long hair, and not in the official image we are all familiar with, where they are bald and with a much more mature appearance. These young architects had two spiritual fathers. One was the architect Aldo Rossi, who was their professor at ETH Zurich, and the other was the artist Joseph Beuys, who was at that time a major figure in the art world, a guru, if you will, a reference point, at least in the German-speaking world. So much so that sometimes I like to say that the first building by Herzog and de Meuron was a suit they made with Beuys, or rather, a suit that Beuys made for them. For the Basel Carnival in 1978, the Kunstmuseum Basel had purchased a work by Beuys titled For State, but it seemed so strange, so radical, that they decided not to exhibit it. So this group of young friends who were part of a carnival procession decided to dedicate their carnival procession to this repressed work by Beuys. They went to see Beuys in Düsseldorf and asked him, "Could you make costumes for the 70 members of our group?" And Beuys created felt costumes for them, which at that time had almost become his signature style, with copper and iron bars, materials that were central to Beuys' relationship with the physical world. These young people paraded through the streets of Basel during that carnival, and their public recognition was so great that Beuys' work was eventually exhibited at the Museum of Contemporary Art. Not only was Beuys' work displayed, but also the remnants of a second work by Beuys, which he called For State 2. And as you can see here, they were a collection of iron rods, copper bars, and above all, a large pile of felt costumes, which remained as remnants of that artistic action but had already become a work of art. This was their first interaction, and you might wonder, what does this have to do with architecture? It has everything to do with architecture in something very important. We've seen with Koolhaas, and even more so with Foster, how architecture can sometimes be a matter of bones, structures, and construction. But architecture also has to do with coverings, with skins, with garments. In the grand Germanic tradition, there has always been a distinction between the two great figures of the 19th century, Schinkel, who defended the structural rationality of the Greeks or the Gothic, and on the other hand, Semper, who argued that architecture was a clad structure, closer therefore to the Renaissance or the Baroque, and not so much to the structural rationality of Schinkel. In this kind of tension, as you might have observed, Foster would undoubtedly choose Schinkel. Jacques Herzog, and I sometimes say Herzog instead of Herzog and de Meuron for brevity, since Herzog is the artistic driving force of the duo, Herzog would undoubtedly choose Semper. Architecture as cladding, not architecture as skeleton. This is why the suit is so fitting, as it perfectly expresses that condition of textile cladding, of ornamental covering, which architecture so often needs, and yet which modernity had excluded from the realm of reflection and the specific practice of this discipline. Beuys provided them with the material, but Rossi gave them the forms. And the forms that Rossi was teaching at that time in Zurich were forms that I won't say were anti-modern, but they certainly reflected on modernity, aiming to recover many things that modernity had denied. When most of you think of modernity, what comes to mind is glass, steel, flat roofs, and a machine-like appearance. Rossi argued that there is great rationality in vernacular architecture, for example, in pitched roofs. Rossi's drawings of beach huts were almost a manifesto, suggesting that this is great rational architecture. Rational architecture does not need flat roofs. It does not need to look like a machine. There can be another kind of rationality, one that is in love with vernacular architecture and the elemental forms we find in our everyday lives, but also imbued with a certain melancholic poetry. In this regard, Rossi's work often recalls De Chirico with that same metaphysical quality, connecting both architects to the metaphysical currents that were influencing the Italian reception during those years. Ultimately, this led these young architects, when they began their work, to approach architecture from a very different perspective than what had been common up until then. Their first house, the Blue House. You might say, well, what a trivial thing, a little house with a pitched roof, some tiny holes. It seems like nothing. But back then, it was revolutionary to design a house with a pitched roof, painted in Klein blue, like the French painter's work, with these seemingly random openings. Or later, when they designed a house for a collector and once again introduced a pitched roof, it was almost a provocation at the time. Unrealized projects like this model show how the quintessential house becomes a form of anthropological reflection on dwelling, but also on architecture itself and what it can achieve. Or this one, a marvelous project where the house is not only built like a fairy tale house, almost like a pumpkin with eyes and a mouth, carved out so that light from within illuminates the night of the landscape, but it's also placed on a tray that seems to float like a magic carpet. It's modern architecture, but not so modern, timeless in many ways. Here are the forms that Rossi gave them, but what's missing is the material that Beuys provided. And that would come in another way. There is this image from a video recorded by Jacques Herzog, where you can see him licking a model. Yes, licking a model. Models aren't meant to be licked, but by doing so, he wanted to convey the idea of wanting an architecture that you can touch, lick, and scratch. He desired a tactile, physical, and bodily relationship with architecture. And then they create this house in Liguria, Italy. It's a house that we refer to as the stone house because, as you can see, it's made of stone slabs, which is a traditional vernacular construction, nothing they invented, but something that is already present, just waiting to be rediscovered and treated differently to make it contemporary, to bring it into our time. How do they make it contemporary? With that large concrete cross on the elevation, on the facade, and also in the floor plan. That large cross, which organizes the entire building. And notice how they treat it. That large cross, which organizes the floor plan, is expressed in this way on the facade, yet differently at the corners. The concrete reveals itself at the center but hides at the corners. Why? Because if that same concrete element had appeared here, even though it's present and supporting the house, it would have made the house banal, trivial, ordinary, a concrete skeleton with stone slab infill. By doing it this way, they distance us, surprise us, and move us, the stone, of course, but also the wood. In Basel, for example, there's this set of houses they designed, very narrow because they were built next to a party wall, so they only have one facade. And by the way, Jacques Herzog himself still lives in one of them. And they interpret the construction in wood as well. Another vernacular method, another traditional approach, but in a different way. Notice how they organize the columns. When they are articulated, they know that there are no loads in those areas, so they can be designed like this. They apply technical knowledge to the vernacular approach, changing and altering it, and then presenting it back to us. Stone, wood, and why not, steel as well. This house, also in Basel, is an apartment building, but suddenly it has an entire facade covered with grates that are used in Basel for drainage systems. These are sewer grates, taken from their humble function and placed in the form of a lattice. At night, this lattice opens up, once again showcasing another way of using the vernacular, the ordinary, the everyday, by elevating it into the realm of art. What they do here, they would later synthesize in another residential project in Paris years later. Of greater scale, curiously located on Rue de Suisse, the Street of the Swiss, it seemed they were destined for it. The part that faces the main facade once again has a cladding, as you can see, a metallic one that expresses a defensive quality, and yet, in the interior courtyard they build this other elongated block with wooden shutters that create lodges and warm interiors with a soft, amber light. This is the floor plan. Here, you can see the two sections that complete the perimeter of the Parisian block, and this large residential structure they build inside using wood. Metal is used where there's the abrasion of the public world, while wood is reserved for the private, more intimate environment. This is the exterior facade. As you can see here, it serves as a light and climate filter for the balconies. And this, by contrast, is the facade of the interior section. As you can see again, it creates interiors that seem like they were painted by Ramon Casas a century ago. This concludes a brief overview of how the teachings of Buys and Rossi are reflected, all within residential buildings, but they take it a step further when they reach different types of clients and create other types of buildings. The first was for a manufacturer of aromatic candies, Ricola. They would design 3 buildings and each one would change, not the course of architecture, but certainly the course of the firm's work. This is simply a warehouse for Ricola, situated in the middle of, here you can see it, in a very wooded area next to some rocky cliffs. Built with ferrocement, a very, very humble material, yet from a distance it looks like the wooden planks of a sawmill. It integrates into the natural landscape with such conviction that we can only describe it as romantic. This is the first time I use this word, but I will use it more because the work of Herzog and de Meuron is so closely tied to German Romanticism, with its empathy for nature and the desire to integrate into it, that I can't avoid it even if I wanted to. Romantic, but of a very different nature, is the next building they create, which undoubtedly becomes their most published work, and the one that starts to make this Swiss duo known around the world. The building itself is hardly anything, a signal cabin among the train tracks in Basel, just this structure here, a box housing control mechanisms for the vast network of Swiss railway tracks in Basel. Why is it so important? Because, under the pretext of needing to insulate it from static electricity and create a Faraday cage, they wrapped it in a copper band that, as you can see, they then altered slightly to allow small openings for light to enter the interior and, during the night, radiate outward, revealing what happens inside. The building itself is absolutely conventional, but it has a completely unexpected wrapping, a covering. The model of this building was the first that the Museum of Modern Art in New York purchased for its permanent collection, recognizing that it was something new, that they had made a leap artistically, a leap in perception. They took something as mundane as a building to house the control mechanisms of the railway tracks and transformed it into an icon, with a subtlety and, at the same time, a mystery and magic that are hard to match. And this is a very fitting moment because I wanted to talk specifically about cladding and why it's important for cladding to suddenly take on architectural significance. I'll illustrate this with the Thorvaldsen Museum. While the museum itself might not hold relative importance, just look at this, a classical building, but suddenly it has things painted on it like palm trees or, for example, these drawings. These are drawings of classical polychromatic ornaments and architectures, which were part of a 19th century debate about whether the Greeks were purely white and Apollonian or, on the contrary, polychromatic and Dionysian. You may know that this division between the Apollonian and the Dionysian was popularized by Nietzsche in The Birth of Tragedy, where he explained how the spirit of dance animates the cold perfection of Greek statuary. Archaeologists reminded us at the same time that these statues and buildings were painted in vivid colors, showing that the Greeks were not only Apollonian and serene, but also allowed themselves to be swept away like drunken nymphs by the wild spirit of Bacchic dance. These drawings are by Semper. The same goes for these here. Semper, when defending architecture not as a skeleton but as skin, as cladding, as a garment, as I mentioned earlier in contrast to Schinkel, also defended ornamentation. He advocated for architecture's ability to become an ornamented skin, a tattooed skin. These drawings of his, which reconstruct classical architectures, were, so to speak, his inspiration to construct his architecture, and it is also true for the architecture of Herzog de Meuron. As you can see, that palmette you saw earlier is exactly or similar to the one they used in the second building they designed for Ricola, the same factory of sugar-free medicinal candies, all made through very ecological botanical processes, so using palmettes was very fitting. The building, as you can see, is just a simple warehouse, a warehouse in Mulhouse, France, with nothing more than a large concrete box and 2 canopies to protect the unloading of trucks. However, the way that entire skin is tattooed carries the intent of conveying that this is not just any factory or warehouse. There's something special here. They communicate this with a repeated image, much like the multiplied drainage grates in the residential building. The influence here isn't solely European. The influence of pop art and Warhol also comes into play. Warhol, with his multiplied silk screens that he was so fond of, touches this project subtly. Yet it remains a profoundly European architecture. This is the second Ricola building, and once again, it marks another step forward in their journey. The Eberswalde Library, however, follows exactly the same approach and intentions as the building you just saw. It's a library designed as a large concrete box, but with a twist. Thanks to Thomas Ruff, a series of scenes are imprinted on each of these glass strips and concrete panels, alluding to the building's function as a library. Iconologists can decipher the specific scenes used in this case. In the end, as you can see here, this is the image that the building presents. And this is a nighttime view, where you can distinguish between what is etched into the concrete and what is screen printed onto the glass. At this point, the habit of referring to Herzog de Meuron's architecture as ornamented minimalism took hold. After all, they were boxes, but with ornamentation that gave them a kind of vibrational quality. I mention ornamentation because, of course, ornament was one of those things that modern architects couldn't include. Somewhat ironically, but seriously as well, Adolf Loos wrote a famous article titled Ornament and Crime, which was widely reproduced. In that article, he explained that just as tattooed people were certainly criminals, ornamented architecture was, without a doubt, an architecture from which the worst could be expected. There was a part of irony, but also a part of truth, as he rejected any ornamentation in his architecture, stripping it of cornices and volutes. Modern architecture had to be bare, so to bring ornamentation back into modern architecture was, once again, something extraordinary and unexpected. And in this as well, Herzog de Meuron innovated, sometimes not just by inviting an artist friend. Of course, being in Basel and having many artist friends, they collaborated continuously with artists, but other times by designing the artist's own studios, as in the case of Thomas Ruff. In doing so, they allowed the ornamentation to come not from some ancient engravings but from nature itself, adorning the facade with the oxidation from the roof's finish, with lichens, with mosses, creating a different kind of ornamentation. Once again, it's romantic and empathetic with nature. They took this to the extreme when they received their first major commission outside of Switzerland. the Dominus Winery in Napa Valley near San Francisco for a renowned Bordeaux winemaker, the same ones behind the famous wine, Petrus, which many of you might recognize. They wanted to expand their operations in America and acquired land for cultivation, commissioning these Swiss architects to design their winery, Dominus Winery, in Napa Valley. They executed it in a completely unexpected way, using something that, until then, had been employed only in public works: gabions. Gabions are wire cages filled with stones, typically used to stabilize slopes after a road has been built or something similar. It's a cheap method engineers use to stabilize slopes. They took this commonplace element, something we often see when driving along roads without paying much attention because it belongs to another world, and transformed it into something different. These gabions, these wire cages filled with stones, in this case, basalt stones, became the cladding, the garment of the building, and at the same time, a screen that protects it from the elements. The building is thus formed as a large stone ribbon, penetrated by these two openings, which serve as access points for the trucks to load the crates of bottles and carry out the industrial part of the winery's operations, all set within a magnificent vineyard landscape. And this is what you see if you get a little closer. Of course, it didn't comply with many regulations, and getting the building permit was extremely difficult. They even had to give up making it accessible to visitors, using most of the small spaces for what they call, well, I won't get into that, but they are used mainly for hosting parties and showing off to friends. In other words, wineries are often places where you can entertain guests, and a winery where you can't bring anyone almost doesn't make sense in Napa Valley. But these French vintners said, no, we just want to produce good wine. We don't care if people can't come in. So, if only the workers are allowed inside, they could relax some of the requirements. Even so, there were still problems. One of them was that birds nested there, laying eggs, and naturally, snakes came after the eggs. As a result, the building was filled with snakes. They solved this in a very ecological way, by playing a continuous melody of chirping birds, but distressed chirping birds. I'm not sure how they managed to make the birds sound distressed, but with that melody, other birds understood that nesting there wouldn't be a good idea, as it would be a bad experience. So, the birds stopped laying eggs and the snakes left, making the solution a success. But of course, when we see these gabions, we might ask, is this architecture? Is it public works? What is it? These large basalt rocks, what are they? And yet this is the great architecture of Herzog de Meuron. It's an architecture that is brutal, that is violent because it's not. It's an architecture that is highly refined and, at the same time, truly impactful, hitting us with its immediacy. Well, what can I say? It was immediately embraced by the fashion world, of course. Such a new kind of architecture. Now you'll see gabions in every public park on the outskirts of Madrid. It's like gabions have spread across the world as a new trend, but it all started here. Naturally, it immediately inspired the fashion world, and not long after, you'd find Herzog himself featured on the cover of the fashion supplement of the New York Times. They were no longer just architects of art. They were becoming architects of fashion as well. But the art world would honor them with the most prestigious commission an architect could aspire to at that time, the Tate Modern. The Tate Modern, located in a disused power station on the banks of the Thames, was a project they won against some of the world's greatest architects, marking their entry into the big leagues. Competing to design the Tate meant truly entering another level of architectural visibility. They approached it with great elegance, adding little more than this glass ribbon over the structure and touching the original building very minimally. And above all, with their most phenomenal idea, keeping the turbine hall intact, which has become the heart of the Tate and the place where artists are celebrated. Here, for example, is The Weather Project by Olafur Eliasson. Here you can see it when Olafur Eliasson created the Weather Project. For an artist, exhibiting in the vast expanse of the Turbine Hall at the Tate is the ultimate achievement. It's a consecration. Juan Muñoz was exhibiting there when, unfortunately, he passed away that summer, and currently, Tacita Dean is the one occupying that space. They managed to transform art into something greater with such a simple decision as keeping the Turbine Hall open. For any artist, filling that space is a challenge, but it's also a form of consecration. Now they have to expand it because it has been such a great success. Once again, they use similar brickwork, slightly more folded and with the same glass bands as before. This is an image of the project as it was completed, where we can see the brick bands and how they reference the main museum, but with a more contemporary look that doesn't compete with the original building. But shortly after, in Duisburg, they created the Küppersmühle, driven somewhat by the success of the Tate. From that point on, whenever there was an abandoned factory to be transformed into a cultural or art space, they were called upon. In this case, they were invited to transform this old abandoned factory on the banks of the Rhine into an art center. And they did it using a method they later employed in other places, including in Madrid with the Caixa Forum. Instead of trying to breathe the same air as the factory, they first, as these protected buildings are considered industrial heritage, bricked up all the windows using bricks fired in the same way, as close as possible to the original factory bricks. In other words, they first reconstructed the entire facade and then opened the necessary apertures, completely independent of the factory's original rhythmic and compositional organization, almost like flaying the ceramic skin of the factory, much like Apollo did to Marsyas. And with a single architectural gesture, a sculptural concrete staircase, similar to the one in Madrid, they created a skin that is first reconstructed, then torn, and finally infused with that grand sculptural gesture. They were beginning to be known as architects who were called upon when there were heritage issues. No one would have guessed, right? These Swiss architects, known for their decorated concrete boxes, suddenly became heritage architects. But that's how it happened. For example, in Munich, they were called to design a shopping center on a very complex block. What did they do? They created 5 courtyards known as Hof. This is the entrance to one of the sections, but with elements, as you can see here, made of copper. And the most important thing, of course, is that this was a block with remnants of other buildings, and in the end, they created a shopping center, but in the form of a passageway with galleries, featuring 5 courtyards and multiple entrances from all the surrounding streets. It's an admirably resolved project. And it has an interior appearance like this, reconciling the radical nature of their architecture with something as demanding and often challenging to resolve as commerce. Designing a shopping center while maintaining architectural integrity is not easy. Many architects have attempted it and almost all have failed, but they achieved it with great elegance in Munich. And finally, what was bound to happen did happen. Their arrival in Spain, starting with the Canary Islands. This is interesting because, in Tenerife, they were commissioned to design a building that was initially intended to be the Oscar Dominguez Museum. The name was later changed and it ultimately became known as TA, Tenerife Espacio de las Artes. They approached it with extraordinary urban intelligence. The building serves various functions, including a library and exhibition spaces, but it features these pieces through which circulation flows, integrating seamlessly into the urban fabric with great intelligence. Suddenly, with the 5 courtyards in Munich and the building in Tenerife, Herzog de Meuron were also becoming urban architects. And here in Tenerife, they explored the concept of facades that appear weathered, as if time had passed over them, showing that things had happened and that they had been degraded by the passage of time. Of course, The Tenerife building took 10 years to complete, so many of these formal inventions appeared first in other buildings of theirs, reaching expression elsewhere before being constructed in Tenerife. This delay, a reflection of our sometimes slow cycles, especially in the island context, meant that while the ideas were invented in Tenerife, they weren't built there first. However, the extended duration of the project allowed for this experimental process of trial and error, which is so interesting. Here's another image of the Tenerife Center where you can see that weathered skin, revealing the exterior. And this formidable image of the interior, where you can see the sections that reveal the library. Because with these buildings, beyond their interesting urban integration, it's crucial to understand them in section. Only in section, by viewing their cut, can we truly appreciate their authentic nature. Tenerife was their first building, which they recently completed with the addition of a plaza. They have also taken on the task of remodeling the docks in this area of Santa Cruz. However, initially, they have completed this new plaza with a large, shallow pond, which has entirely transformed the character of this public space. The initial criticisms were obvious. Why are we left with so little walkable surface? Yet now, people have come to appreciate it because it's a gesture of such energy and intent. This shallow pond, despite its minimal depth, has a presence and urban impact that makes it truly memorable. They weren't as fortunate in Barcelona. In Barcelona, they designed this building you see here. This blue triangular building, located where the diagonal meets the sea, within the complex of the Forum of Cultures. A building conceived as a triangle, also inclined blue, with these rough textures, also torn and above all, with a plaza shaded from the sun by the elevated structure of the building. But although it has beautiful moments in its interior and experimental features overall, it didn't go well. Almost nothing at the Forum went well, so perhaps it wasn't entirely their fault, but it was one of those projects where, for various reasons, almost all the elements were somewhat forgettable. And that was also the case for Herzog and de Meuron's contribution. But they were able to redeem themselves in Madrid with one of their best works to date, the Caixa Forum, located on Paseo del Prado. First, they employed the same technique as in the Küppersmühle, blinding all the existing windows with the same type of brick and ceramic material, and then tearing open new ones without regard for the original facade composition. But here, they added more. To start, they lifted the building off the ground, removing the granite podium that was originally justified because the area was surrounded by other buildings, including a gas station in front. It was a cultural center that didn't have room to breathe, so they decided to create air underneath. Later, circumstances became more favorable. The institution was able to buy and demolish the gas station, and a nearby power plant burned down and was also demolished, creating urban space around it, making the plaza beneath the building less essential than it once was. Additionally, they added large perforated steel volumes that raised the structure to the height of the neighboring rooftops. In early designs, they even considered reproducing a fragment of Madrid's rooftops, attempting to be traditional yet distinct from it. And finally, as the English say, last but not least, there's the green wall that, interestingly, isn't theirs. The amusing thing is that this feature, which brought so much fame to the building, wasn't designed by Herzog and de Meuron, although they did choose to bring the artist in. It was the work of a French gardener and landscape artist named Patrick Blanc, who, despite his name, is entirely dressed in green, with green hair, green nails, green shoes, and he creates these remarkable installations. But let me explain the layout to you. On the left, you have the existing building. They removed a portion of it to create a plaza in the center and added this elevated structure on top. They also added the section below, which houses the auditorium that couldn't be placed anywhere else. This is the initial sketch, showing the plaza and the covered plaza. This is, let's say, the section of the building I mentioned earlier, which is always so important. You can see the auditorium beneath the plaza and this sculptural staircase that opens upwards. And to the right, of course, is Patrick Blanc's green wall. You can see here the breakdown of each of the floors, which ultimately form this extraordinary collage. This design also connects with the fact that the building is located across from the botanical garden. It's a way of saying, across from the Villanueva gate of the botanical garden, we are here, and giving a green nod to the garden across the street. The building rises like this with these large volumes. Once again, with that weathered, eroded look. And it has that folded expression on the inside, both in the plaza, that you can see here as well as in the area, let's say, at the first floor level, where visitors are received and traffic is distributed. It's one of Herzog de Meuron's most successful buildings, so much so that in his latest book, Charles Jenks, who, after all, invented postmodern architecture and gave it its name, says that in the last 30 years, there hasn't been a more important building than this one. He claims this building expresses all the values and conflicts of our time. I haven't shown you the staircase yet, and I have to show it to you. But I'm doing it with a bit of a trick because I'm showing it before a change in safety regulations required the addition of a railing to the parapet, which detracts from its appearance. However, since it's managed by a bank, they couldn't avoid it. Although the building had started construction under a different set of regulations and could have been left as it was, the bank insisted, and now, when you visit, you'll see it's all surrounded by a railing that somewhat diminishes the sculptural strength of this extraordinary staircase, which was the most difficult part of the building to construct. It wasn't the raising of the structure. It was this staircase that was the most challenging to build. The same strategy, used here in Hamburg for what is now the largest and most controversial project they have undertaken, the Elbphilharmonie. They've built an opera house atop an industrial warehouse on the dock. Here it is, under construction. This is the view once it was completed. And at night, a colossal building with a controversy just as colossal over its cost, the difficulties, and its presence. It will be the icon of Hamburg, the gateway to Germany. And surely we will forget all this in 40 years. But right now, if you visit Hamburg, the newspapers are aflame almost daily with the madness of building an opera house atop an industrial building. There are also challenges like soundproofing against the ship horns, which has increased its cost by nearly a third. I returned to Spain to extremely important projects in their career that sadly remain unrealized, the Ciudad del Flamenco in Jerez. Here, once again, they use these weathered screens, but this time based on Islamic patterns, which you can see here. And of which they have produced many models. This one is in the courtyard of their studio, a full-scale one. One model of how they plan to realize this future Ciudad del Flamenco, which, unfortunately, has yet to begin construction. Another project that has yet to begin is the Espacio Goya in Zaragoza. In Zaragoza, there were two large buildings dating back to the 1908 Hispano-French Exposition. One of them houses a fine arts museum, and the other is an art school. The proposal was to expand the museum into the adjacent building, creating a dedicated Goya museum by uniting the two structures and relocating the students to a more peripheral space, of course. Herzog de Meuron first connected them through the corridors you see there, and in their second version, with this other, more lightweight approach. But the most important and remarkable aspect of this project, which makes it singular and extraordinary, is how to create a Goya museum when your client doesn't actually own any Goyas. This was the fundamental problem. They might have a few Goyas, some engravings, but not much more. The genius of Herzog and de Meuron was to create these spaces you see here, spaces of reference that literally reproduce the environments where Goya painted his frescoes, but without filling them with the actual frescoes, which would have turned it into something akin to Las Vegas, a completely intolerable facsimile. Instead, what they do is leave these spaces bare and commission contemporary artists who breathe the same air as Goya, who admire Goya, and who wish to pay homage to Goya in the very spaces where he worked. One of these spaces, of course, is San Antonio de la Florida, but there are many others where Goya left his best frescoes. So, the frescoes are present in spirit, as these are the spaces where they were created, but other artists reinterpret Goya and make him their own. The idea is to create a Goya museum with contemporary artists who admire Goya, and with lateral references to Goya's work. It's a smart solution because it resolves the problem the clients couldn't solve: how to have a grand Goya museum in Zaragoza without having enough Goyas to fill it. And another project that is currently being executed and has gone through so many vicissitudes that I won't delve into it too much is the headquarters of the Banco Bilbao Vizcaya. It's located on a somewhat peripheral, not particularly distinguished plot, and they've designed it as a series of bands, as you can see, with courtyards in between them. There's also a large, I'm not sure whether to call it a tower or a sheet, but a circular form that looks as if the courtyard was cut out and stood upright, as if we had cut this part of the building and placed it here in front. With the intention of reaching the same height as the original bank headquarters, which, as you know, they've since sold. It's a sad and complicated commission with challenging clients. Of course, they themselves weren't very experienced in working with a bank, having mostly collaborated with museum directors and people from the art world. Working with a bank is very difficult, especially when, in many cases, the project is ultimately seen and treated solely as a real estate venture. The project has undergone many changes, and there have been several times when they've threatened to abandon it or to prevent it from being published under their name. However, given its size, I had no choice but to mention it here. This is the final result as it has been built, where we can see the changes and how the original idea has somewhat faded. It's now more of a conventional headquarters rather than the vertical courtyard concept they initially envisioned. Here's another image from the interior courtyards, where we can see those initial horizontal bands. However, it ultimately feels more like a typical office building rather than a true Herzog and de Meuron design. The firm is growing, and now, in addition to the two founding partners, there are two more, Kristen Bisbanger and Harry Gugger. This expansion begins to transform the dynamics of the studio, as it becomes noticeable which partner is behind each project. And then two more partners are added, Ashkan Mordazai and a young partner, Stefan Marbach. The addition of these partners marks further growth for the studio, both in responsibilities and in the dispersion of work. And at that moment, the third Ricola building represents their third major shift. I'm showing you the drawings of the project here, and you might think they're from two different projects, but no, they're from the same project, just before and after. These are Herzog's drawings for the Ricola marketing headquarters when he still thought he could create another small box in the style of Aldo Rossi, with that tactile quality. And then, this is what sometimes happens in architecture, a leap into the unknown. This is the sketch of the building that actually gets built. There are moments in architecture where you can't quite explain how you move from one idea to another. It's not a linear progression from A to B. It's a leap into the void. The same architect sketching these ideas for Ricola marketing suddenly one day draws this. And in the end, they build this, a building with a fractured glass facade, supported by flexible poles that hold up a vegetated roof, seamlessly integrating into its surroundings. And in the end, they build this, a building with a fractured glass facade, supported by flexible poles that hold up a vegetated roof, seamlessly integrating into its surroundings. In a way that almost blends with it, how can we not use the word romantic once again? There is empathy with nature here, while clearly maintaining their ties with the art world. In this case, both Adrian Schiess and Rosemarie Trockel created these textile artworks, these colorful curtains. That gives it that unique feeling, but what's important here isn't so much the collaboration with artists, which is always present in Herzog's work, but the way the building fractures into that star-like glass form, where the reflections, as we saw earlier, cause the building to blur and blend with the surrounding vegetation. This marks an extraordinary shift, and from this point on, Herzog's work would never be the same. They created other buildings in Lausanne, Seattle, and London, where that same chromatic vibration is present and which bears the name of the famous choreographer, as you know. Or this renovation project in Basel, where they once again play with colors, and at certain moments, with images almost reminiscent of shamanic designs, for the rehabilitation pools. However, what's truly important about what these architects did here isn't just these elements I'm showing you. The key achievement was convincing their client not to build a rehabilitation center vertically, but to design it horizontally. The client initially wanted a tower, but the architects argued, if the building is filled with people in wheelchairs, with elevators constantly in use and lines forming, how is that possible? They persuaded the client to opt for a horizontal building. Someone wanted to build a vertical structure because, as you know, hospitals are often built vertically. It's seen as the most efficient way. But the best approach, as they saw it, was in this absolutely horizontal building. And amidst this new world of color and dissolution of form, there are occasional returns to the old world, the world of Rossi. Take, for instance, buildings like the Sauerlager, a structure that serves both as an exhibition space and a warehouse, as its name suggests. They even wanted to build it with adobe, but in the end, that wasn't possible. The Swiss regulations were more stringent than any other, and they didn't allow them to construct these large walls with adobe. However, they aimed to return to that elemental construction, that raw, primary form of building. The same intention is evident in that small house, where they sought to reduce the building to its most essential architectural expression. This is the interior, with the large halls where the artworks are stored, and the lower area where exhibitions are occasionally held. And notice that in their desire for this architecture to barely seem like architecture at all, but rather like something resembling a cave or a geological formation, even the windows were designed as cracks in this rough surface, which was actually formed using tubes, struck to create the negative space of those cracks through which the building gazes outward. These experiences led them to create two major museums simultaneously in America. One is the De Young Museum, where they translated these experiments with the facade into these copper skins, as you can see, with which the entire museum would ultimately be clad. In an idyllic location within Golden Gate Park where an earthquake had severely damaged the existing building, it had to be replaced. They constructed this new building, where much of their usual effort was focused on the tower. The previous building had a tower for viewing the landscape, and they decided to create a new one themselves, which tops off a building that, as you can see, features large sculptural gestures all clad in copper, which is the most defining element of the building. And for the tower, as I mentioned, this is where they concentrated most of their efforts, experimenting with different construction schemes. And it ultimately materialized in that object, rising above the trees. The De Young Museum in San Francisco became a significant American work and a highly visited one at that. It's quite different from creating a winery in Napa Valley that isn't open to the public. Clearly, this was their calling card in the American architectural scene. And the other was the Walker Art Center in Minneapolis, Minnesota, somewhat isolated in the Midwest, yet with a consistently avant-garde program that is highly respected in the art world. In this case, it was aluminum that they decided would be the skin to clad the building, once again featuring fractured forms. And an aluminum skin that also wrinkles, much like that of the De Young Museum. It's manipulated to create a distinct image of an unfinished object where its geometries are quite different from those they had used on other occasions. And once again, we see the presence of decorative patterns, especially at the entrances to the galleries. Even in the auditorium, where these patterns, almost lace-like, and the soft-edged openings create a surreal atmosphere. For them, this was a way of expressing what they believe is their most erotic space, with these windows that resemble almost organic orifices. By then, the firm had grown significantly, but it remained in the same location. They never moved. While Foster and Koolhaas have had multiple studios, moving from one place to another as their offices expanded, Herzog and de Meuron have never been able to do that. They've stayed on the same street, simply expanding by taking over spaces around them. Here, you can see that they even made their fence using leftover materials from the tests they conducted for the De Young Museum. And now it's a collection of buildings in the old part of Basel, on the edge of the Rhine. Where they continue to grow by accumulation, their studio is essentially a labyrinth. A labyrinth because it's like a plant that doesn't want to lose its roots, continuously sprouting new branches but never wanting to leave. They expand by taking over this building here and that building there. And in the end, the studio is just that, a collection of spaces. Here you have the two partners, Pierre de Meuron and Jacques Herzog, the same two boys who grew up on the same street in Basel since the 1950s, went to the same school, the same university, shared similar family backgrounds, and remained together. Their partnership endures with a solidarity that often breaks down in architectural firms or between architectural partners, but not for them. They maintain a deep loyalty to their origins, physically, socially, and geographically, to the roots of their lives and their studio. Where it's always easy to find many young people taking breaks, creating a spirit that's quite different from other offices, where the environment is more abrasive. But here, because Switzerland is like this, the work environment is especially pleasant. And with the help of this ever-growing studio, now with more partners, more teams, and more young talent, they created two buildings that I'll briefly describe because I believe they are among the most beautiful in their career. One of them involved extensive testing for Miuccia Prada, who had also worked with Rem Koolhaas to design the Prada headquarters in Tokyo, in a fashion district where many architects have built. Renzo Piano, Kazuyo Sejima, and others have worked there, but none with the intelligence and exquisiteness that Herzog and de Meuron brought to this store for Prada in Tokyo. A building that is, in effect, like a small gem, a jewel, with that structural skin that perfectly expresses its section. Formed with these curved glass panels, sometimes curving inward, sometimes outward, to give the entire store the appearance of a jewel. And as I mentioned, it expresses itself in the section, where, in addition to the sales floors, the fitting rooms and other areas are shaped into these rhomboidal section tubes that are then expressed in the structural facade. It is undoubtedly one of their most beautiful buildings, a small gem in their career, But there's another small gem as well, and I mention this because the two large American museums, the De Young and the Walker, despite all the great effort, large budgets, and extensive spaces, haven't been as successful as these smaller buildings. This small one for Prada, or this one they created, and I'll tell you how, in Cottbus, East Germany, where they built a library. It's fascinating to see these two models, both for the same building. You might wonder, just as we saw with the Ricola marketing building, how it's possible. In this case, there was a pause. The model on the top is from 1998 and the one on the bottom is from 2001. They designed the building, won the competition, but then the project stalled for 3 years. When they were finally told to go ahead with construction, they realized they couldn't build the building they had won the competition with, the one with rough, severe boxes. Why? Because this was for a university in East Germany, a place that was very sad, gray, and dull. They said, "No, this building has to be an icon. It has to bring some joy, some uniqueness. It has to be perceived as something different from what's there. It can't be one of our Swiss buildings which could just be a decorated box." In the interim, they had completed the Ricola marketing building, taking that leap into the unknown. So they proposed a building like this, in the shape of an amoeba, surrounded by trees. This is the building, and these are the successive models. Notice how they start and where they end up. This is a creative journey, a process of better understanding. One might ask, is it better to make it square, round, or amoeboid? But it's a process of thinking about what should be done in each case. In this instance, they gradually understood the place better and realized that a building that appeared trivial wouldn't be understood. They needed to create a building with a more iconic presence. And indeed, their final sketches resemble the sketches of Alvar Aalto's vase, belonging to that more poetic, more organic world. The building was ultimately constructed as an extrusion with that amoeboid floor plan, and then covered with a skin that is, of course, tattooed with letters, because it's a library. As you can see here, in the end, the letters form a decorative pattern on the glass, giving the building an image of transparency and subtlety. Yet, the curves impart a memorable quality to it. The floor plans are extraordinary. Here is the sequence of floor plans, where what you see in black represents the walkable areas and the white areas are voids. Using the same amoeboid shape, sometimes one part of the floor is built, sometimes another, creating a series of voids spanning 2 or 3 floors, which you can see here. And this gives the building an extraordinary interior richness. It's not just a building with floors wrapped in a round exterior, no. Inside it contains spaces of incredible intelligence and spatial richness. And the staircases. Here you might recall Koolhaas's library and the vivid colors he used. Once again, the staircases here fully embrace vibrant colors. And they arrived at a suspended design, similar to what Koolhaas had done with the staircases in the Seattle Library, which was built around the same time. It's no secret that these architects keep an eye on each other, always watching what the others are doing. And to conclude this podcast with a sequence on stadiums, Jacques Herzog is very fond of football. The Basel studios even have a small tournament among themselves, and his daughter plays for the Swiss national youth team. As football fans know, the Basel team almost always wins the Swiss league and has played in the Champions League, etc. In fact, FC Barcelona was founded by a man from Basel, Joan Gamper, which is why he chose the colors of the Basel team for the Barca jersey. So the famous Blaugrana colors of Barca come from Basel, just like the first Spanish Bible. For architects so close to the world of football, being commissioned to remodel the stadium of their club was the highest honor. Indeed, they remodeled the St. Jakob-Park Stadium, covering it with this skin you see here, a bit similar to that of the Prada building, but in this case, using plastic instead of glass. which has this exterior appearance, but indeed at night it transforms into an image befitting the celebration of football, when fans gather to cheer and enjoy the possible victory of their team. The next project was even more significant because it wasn't just a renovation, it was a brand new stadium, and moreover, in Munich, a major city with big clubs, the Allianz Arena. And this time, they used a new material called ETFE, ethylene tetrafluoroethylene. It's a bit of a mouthful, but it's essentially a plastic that inflates like cushions, allowing for the creation of facades much more cost-effectively than with glass or rigid plastic. This is a flexible plastic, a very thin membrane that inflates, and as you can see, it ends up looking like a dirigible. But this dirigible, illuminated from within, can display different colors, a very useful feature when different clubs play there. The Germans have the good sense to let two teams share the stadium since each team plays at home every other week. That's the case here. When Bayern Munich plays, the stadium lights up in red, matching the club's colors. When TSV 1860 Munich plays, the stadium glows blue, and when the national team plays, it's illuminated in white. So, 3 colors for the 2 city clubs and the national team. The stadium is extraordinary, with a lightness and lyrical beauty that's hard to describe. Here you can see it illuminated in red for Bayern Munich. Tonight, TSV 1860 Munich is playing. And tonight, the national team is playing. You can tell who's playing by the color of the stadium. This building, so light and beautiful, looks like a dirigible that lost its way and landed gracefully in a meadow. It's colossal. It's enormous. This gives you an idea of just how big it is. But this gives you an even better sense of just how big it is. Its sheer scale has something lyrical about it, but all of that was taken a step further with what would become the Beijing National Stadium for the Olympics, representing the great emerging nation on the planet. When they won the competition, Jacques and Pierre said, "We're not the only authors. The third author is Ai Weiwei, the artist." Not long ago, you probably saw the list of the most influential figures in the art world, and the most influential was this Chinese artist, Ai Weiwei. He recently exhibited in the Turbine Hall at the Tate with the famous installation of sunflower seeds and has been in the news worldwide after being detained and held incommunicado by the police for nearly 2 months because, in addition to being an artist, he is a dissident. So much of a dissident that he didn't attend the opening ceremony of the Olympics. He agreed to design the stadium with Herzog de Meuron, but refused to contribute to the Chinese regime's propaganda by attending the ceremony. Here you have the 3 co-authors of this extraordinary stadium. It's clear that the inspiration for the design, particularly the part introduced by Ai Weiwei, comes from traditional Chinese vessels, or these rolls of rope used in manufacturing. An extraordinary object like a giant steel mesh that is indeed. It's fitting for an authoritarian country, and it was built with a very large workforce, often under conditions not comparable to those in the West, but in the end, it results in the construction of an architectural object. So naturally, films were made about the construction of the stadium. Even China's national airline uses it in their advertising for their routes. And it even appears on Chinese banknotes now. I believe Jacques, Pierre, and Ai Weiwei have good reasons to be proud. And to celebrate the culmination of this iconic project, the question now is, after achieving this, what do you do next? What can you do next in your professional life? It's a question many architects face. We see it in the career of Gehry. After the Guggenheim, after creating something like that, what do you do? What do you do after creating an icon for 1.2 billion people, for the world's second largest power, soon to be the first in 15 years? What do you do next? There are many possibilities. You could design a parking garage in Miami that showcases its structure, blending leisure with cars. Or you could design luxury apartments in New York that appear to be stacked in an apparently unstable manner. Or you could design the headquarters of a pharmaceutical company in Basel, also with pieces seemingly stacked one on top of the other. You could even complete exquisite works like this one, the VitraHaus, where, again, elements are stacked, but this time it's the essential house forms they learned to create with Aldo Rossi, extruded and transformed not only into a showroom, but also into a statement. This is a house. Because, as you know, Vitra sells furniture, not just for offices, but also for homes. And what better place to showcase domestic furniture than this? Return to Aldo Rossi and return to Aldo Rossi's city, Milan. To design a building for the Feltrinelli Foundation with pointed glass roofs that reconstruct one of the city gates. And even better, you could go to upstate New York, to the rural parts of the state, and build a museum unlike the increasingly extravagant designs of recent decades. Instead, you create a museum that's barely more than 2 metal sheds, supported by wooden beams. And in the landscape, it's nothing more than a line, seemingly almost nothing. But to create that almost nothing, you likely have to have done almost everything before. And that brings us to the end of this journey through the remarkable work and evolution of Herzog de Meuron. From iconic stadiums to subtle, almost invisible lines in the landscape, their architecture spans a spectrum that few can rival. Whether they're crafting grand statements or quiet masterpieces, their work consistently challenges and redefines what architecture can be. Thank you for joining me on this exploration. If you enjoyed the video, please give it a thumbs up, share your thoughts in the comments below, and don't forget to subscribe for more deep dives into the world of architecture. See you in the next one.